Welcome to The Long Haul, the podcast dedicated to empowering small carriers and owner-operators to drive their business forward. I'm your host, Adam Wingfield, bringing you insights from industry leaders, real-world success stories, and strategies to help you navigate the road to profitability. Whether you're just getting started or looking to take your fleet to the next level, this is the show where trucking meets opportunity. So buckle up, it's time to go the distance. What's up, everybody, and welcome to the inaugural edition of the Long Haul Podcast, where we're going to provide insights and actionable information for you. But at the same time, we're going to sprinkle in a little bit of inspiration, something that you can actually build off of. I am super excited to get started with today's episode. And today, he doesn't need an introduction, but I'm going to do it anyway. So today we've got the pleasure of hosting a visionary, a pilot, a founder, a family man. His passion for transportation is deeply rooted, having grown up around trucks and all that good stuff, working on the motor operations at US Express, founded FreightWave to provide data and analytics and risk management in transportation. But beyond trucking, his enthusiasm spans across various modes of transportation and even into the space. In 2021, he acquired Flying Magazine, catering to aviation enthusiasts. Remember, I told you he was a pilot. Less than 7 months ago, he expanded into the boating industry by purchasing major publications. Most recently, under his media company Firecrown, he acquired a suite of railroad and astronomy-related publications, including astronomy magazines, a personal favorite from his childhood. His multifaceted ventures highlight his commitment to connecting the enthusiasts and the professionals across transportations and everything else abroad. Please welcome me in joining the founder, the CEO, the pilot, the head chief in charge, Craig Fuller. Welcome, Craig, for the first inaugural episode.
I'm honored to be here. Super excited to come here and join you and kick this thing off.
Man, tell me a little bit about the trucking history. The folks that are on this podcast are just they're owner operators, fleet owners, small folks. They're on. Let's tell them a little bit about your background in trucking. Where did it all stem from?
Yeah, I literally grew up in the business. I like to say I had diesel in my blood, which is probably a true statement.
Pretty common.
My grandfather was in trucking and actually had a number of trucking companies. He took a company, had a trucking company he took public called Countrywide, which is very similar to the mortgage company. In fact, supposedly in family lore, the name Countrywide for the mortgage company was bought from his trucking company. He took it public, and then CSX, the railroad, bought it in the 70s. And then he had another trucking company called Southwest Motor Freight, and he sold it. He was a big guy in M&A and transactions. My dad and my uncle worked in that business. And the guy that bought it ended up going to prison for embezzling a bunch of money. And my dad and my uncle were like, peace, we're out. And they went out and started their own trucking companies. One became US Express, which became the 5th largest. That was in 1985. I was 6 years old when my father started that business. Wow. And my uncle started a company called Covenant Transport, which is, I think, the 8th largest trucking company in the US. And that also started in 1985. So I grew up in big trucking, if there was such a thing, and around the industry. And I saw my father and my uncle bootstrap their businesses and build something of real substance.
What did that feel like? Talk about that bootstrapping experience. You know, you spoke about US Express, which, mind you, when I was out there running the highways, a day wouldn't go by where I wouldn't see a red and white US Express truck. They were absolutely everywhere. So when you said 5th largest, that comes as no surprise. Mm-hmm. Tell us about what that felt like, you know, from a child, you know, watching your dad, you know, bootstrap a company, and what did that feel like for you? What did you witness?
You know, I was 6 years old when my dad came home and told my mom he wanted to start his own company. And I remember her crying. I remember, you know, 6, you don't really know what's going on.
Yeah,
you have a little bit of sort of awareness, but not a lot.
Yeah.
But I remember my mom was very, very upset. And this went on for a while. There was a lot of stress. It was 3 of us, 3 boys and my parents. And, you know, we had my dad had a nice job. He was running operations for this guy who bought my grandfather's company.
Yeah.
And it was a matter of basically my mom was just worried about how are you going to feed these kids?
Yeah.
I think it's stressful in any entrepreneurial's background of having your family's along that ride for you. But I remember pretty early on my dad's business became really successful. This is 1985. It was 5 years after deregulation. So the business was it was a part of the trucking industry, particularly in long haul, when it was a high growth industry, where businesses were growing exceptionally quick. And he was scaling his business really, really quickly because there was this macro picture of what was taking place in the 80s was trucking was deregulated. Big box retailers, Walmart was opening stores all over the country. And the long haul market and just-in-time trucking was starting to take hold in our economy. And, right time, right place, right team, it was the magic formula for success. And he had learned the trucking business from my grandfather, who was no longer active in the business at this point and knew the playbook. And so I saw my father really build this business. And I think like a lot of entrepreneurs, it was long days, long nights.
Yeah.
Our family's vacations were going to trucking, like
Conferences and
Laredo,
stuff.
Texas.
Yeah,
let's
yeah.
go to Laredo, or let's go to Fontana, California.
Yeah.
It was not like we were taking these cool trips to, all my friends were going skiing in the mountains or going to, to the beach. We were going to truck terminal locations. Not that there's anything wrong with Detroit, but that was our family vacations. As my dad would take a visit. I remember we spent weeks at Oklahoma City, because they had a big truck terminal off of I-40, and that was our life. And it was like, but man, as a kid, I loved it. It was like we would get the new trucks would roll in, because when he started that business, he had 50. He was able to get 50 trucks. And there's a lot of whole history to this thing. As the guy who had bought my grandfather's company, a company called Southwest Motor Freight. And there's actually a video I did a couple of years back where I interviewed my dad. And he tells the story, and things I didn't even know, but the guy that had bought my grandfather's business liked trucking because it was a cash flow business.
Yeah.
He was started embezzling the money. And my dad was he left, but what he did was he went and called all the customers that was a part of that business and said, hey, this thing's going down to 2, I'm out. And they're like, hey, we want to give you business. And that was they benefited from being able to basically build a business in spite of everything going on, and were really successful, and that really pushed them along.
So let me do some math. So we started off with about 50 trucks.
Started with 50, yeah.
With 50. So medium-sized, but not necessarily amongst the small guys.
And those days would have been big.
Yeah, you would consider that big.
Deregulation, during regulation trucking, there was a limit on how many, I think it was 50.
Right.
You could only own 50 trucks.
Yeah.
And so he started with the 50 trucks. David Parker started with 25. And there was another business partner, his name was Pat Quinn. So each of them went to the bank. And these were highly credible, bankable folks that were able to get financing for effectively 75 trucks. And what happened is David Parker and my father, who there was a step-brother relationship.
Sure.
There's a lot of conflict in that.
Yeah.
And so David Parker took his 25 trucks and went over and started Covenant. My father and the guy named was Pat Quinn started U.S. Express with 50.
So we went from 50 trucks to, I think when it sold, and I might have my math wrong, but it had about 15,500 trailers.
Yeah, I think it was 7,100 trucks. And I think the number of trailers might have been over, at one point, 20,000.
That's amazing.
I do think that they shrunk the trailer fleet in the last couple of years of the business. But there was, at one point, I think there was about 20,000 trailers.
I'm gonna fast forward a little bit. We go from 6 years old, young kid watching the family. That trucking lifestyle is a lifestyle, man. It's not a job. It's a true lifestyle. You watch that go through from a bootstrapping perspective, and this is for those bootstrappers that are listening. You watched it grow. Then came the teenage years, went off to college to Baylor, right?
Yep, Baylor University.
What did you study at Baylor? Were you in supply chain then, or what were you?
No, I don't even think supply chain was a concept in college back then. It was, I remember there were transportation logistics degrees, but I don't even remember supply chain being maybe at that point. A lot of transportation logistics colleges rebranded as supply chain.
Supply chain.
Sexier.
Yeah.
The sexier brands, they were supply chain versus transportation.
Yeah.
I do remember when I was looking for college, I wanted to go into aviation. My dream was to be Fred Smith. That was like, Fred Smith, the founder of FedEx, was like a hero. But he had airplanes. My family had trucks, but I thought the airplanes were, as a pilot, were the sexier part of logistics, particularly the international piece. So I chose Baylor because it had had an aviation major. It had international business and entrepreneurship, and that's what I ended up going to Baylor for. And actually, telecommunications was another major they had. I found out telecommunications was radio, and I was like, who would want to do broadcast?
Yeah, right.
Now
I'm
a media guy. But I thought it was like satellites and stuff. Telecommunications to me, but that wasn't what it was about. But I ended up going to Baylor. And at that point, it would be 1997 when I entered university. I was 18 years old. And at that point, I was aware that my family was super successful. And then, so it had gone from in the 80s, and 50 trucks is a very successful. But there was a point where growing up, the business, my dad was working so hard to build the business.
Yeah.
And in the early days, I mean, his business started in a trailer in Dalton, Georgia, off Doug Gap Road. I'll never forget it. And it was this just trailer. We would go down there and hang out. It was a gravel parking lot. And I remember my favorite things to do was when the trucks would get delivered and the smell of the tire and the axle grease.
Yeah, man.
Something about
it does
that.
something to you,
it's
man.
Like an aphrodisiac.
It does something to you, man.
It's like, if you know what that's like, and I just remember going down there, and it was a special day where we would go down there. And the thing, my dad's routine would be, he would always drive the terminal parking lot, and we'd count the number of trucks. Because if they were sitting at the lot, that meant they weren't working.
That's utilization, man.
And so
that's
he would
utilization.
Count, figuring out how many trucks.
Yeah.
And it was a routine he did.
Yeah.
So we would leave dinner. We lived in Chattanooga, and his business was in Dalton, Georgia. But we would leave dinner, because as an entrepreneur, we didn't have much time to cook. Cooking wasn't a part of our family thing. We ate out every night, it felt like. And but we would get in the car as a family every single night, and we'd drive down to Dalton. So my because this was pre-cell phone.
Yeah.
It was pre-computer.
Live in the moment times.
And it was literally, he would go through and count the number of trucks sitting at the yard.
I love that.
And I saw my father build this business out of passion and grit and love for it. And the thing that I would say that was more formative as a father, and I have 5 kids, but there was something about listening to my dad asking. I was very curious about how the business worked. How'd you get business? How'd you get drivers? And just wanted to be a sponge of his knowledge, because I adored my father. I looked up to him. He was a force in my life. He still is. And that was how I learned how the trucking business operated, was just from his eyes. And he had the fortunate reality of working for his father, who didn't really start out in trucking. He owned a Volkswagen dealership, one of the first in the 1960s, importing cars from Germany. This is before the bug craze. And some truck driver came in and traded a semi, these days was cab overs, for 2 bugs. I don't know why, but he wanted 2 bugs. He wanted to get rid of the truck. And my grandfather tried to sell that truck and couldn't do it, and so he put it to work. And that was sort of my family's first foray into trucking. And he became a sort of an icon of long-haul trucking.
So you watched all the intricate moments. You just talked about a moment where we teach heavily about fleet optimization and how passionate he was and how drilled he was into the numbers. We fast forward a little bit. You actually went to work for your dad.
Yeah, I did. I actually was working to my dad before I was legally allowed to. I mean, I was working around the office at 10. And I was a computer nerd. And this was in the days of Microsoft DOS, if you remember that.
I love them with the big 5 1/4 inch floppy disk.
We had 5 1/4, 3,
3.5.
And then you had the prompt.
Yeah.
And we had in our house, because my dad would come home and work all hours of the night, as any entrepreneur does. And we had a PC, an IBM PC, and we had a couple of games, a Microsoft Flight Simulator, which is why I became a pilot.
Oh my God, yeah.
And so I knew how to use the computer, and this is at a time when computers were starting to come into the office. So I became the company's first help desk tech at like 10 years old, was fixing computers around the office. And that was sort of, I would go to the office with my dad and work in it, and that was the thing. And the company was bigger than it was. It probably was a couple, at this point, maybe 200 to 300 trucks when I first started sort of going into the office and being with him.
That's big for the folks that are listening.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is absolutely big, having this perspective of a company that ended up getting quite large. it was just part of that journey.
Yeah.
And at those days, it felt like the business was unstoppable. It felt like my father was unstoppable. But I was learning just being in an entrepreneurial family, you learn the business is your life. And there's an interesting thing. You're a big X person. I'm a big Twitter. I still call it.
I still call it Twitter.
Because people are like, what is X? But it's, there's this whole thing. There's this great landman quote it was Jerry Jones talking about his family. And there's this idea that Jerry Jones is talking about how important it was to build the Dallas Cowboys, but he got to do it with his kids.
Yeah.
And that was sort of the way I grew up, is my father wanted his kids to be in the business, and we got to see everything firsthand.
The crazy thing is that when you think about it, and I'll never forget, someone said, I think it was Ryan Clark, when he was talking about building your business for your kids, not to do it that way because, who's to say that your kids don't necessarily want to go in business with you? But there was so many valuable lessons that just based on what I'm hearing about you and your journey, there was a lot of valuable lessons that you learned.
There was so many.
And so when we fast forward a little bit, there were some tough lessons that you learned.
Yeah.
And there was a moment in your career with US Express that was, it was kind of interesting, to say the least, where, you kind of left the company.
I got fired twice. My father has fired me twice.
Yeah.
I got fired in 2005. My brother, I had gone to Baylor, and US Express had started, a really bad decision, by the way, in hindsight, an air freight business, an on-demand air freight business to compete with a company called Ford Air.
Yeah, I remember Ford Air.
US Express was the only major national competitor to it. And I was in Dallas, I was in Waco at Baylor, and wanted to work in this business because I thought air freight was cool. I'm a pilot again.
Yeah.
And I took over the sales territory. The Dallas rep left, and there was this opening, and in both Austin and so they gave me the Austin sales territory as a young kid, and man, I killed it because I was working 18-hour days, Austin for air freight, and that market grew, and they're like, hey, we have this opportunity in Dallas. We're going to hire some other people to come in, and I took over the Dallas sales territory, but there's two other salespeople hired as well.
Yeah.
I was doing 85% of the business. But the secret for me was I figured out, because I would get up at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and I would work all night. But I was a lazy, right out of college. And I would go to the bar. I would invite all the air freight forwarders that were around the airport. We would meet at the bar. And I realized that if I opened a tab and I could network at the bar, that would be all my sales. I had to make 40 sales calls in a week. And what I learned listening to these air freight forwarders talk about business was that they were charging on a truckload. I became the truckload guy at the Dallas-Fort Worth airport. Yeah. Because everybody else was selling airport, expedite, LTL. I was selling truckload because I knew it. And I was making $200 to $300 profit on a truckload out of these forwarders. And these guys were talking about how they made $9,000 because they consolidated 3 truckloads, or they made thousands. They were bragging about how much money they were making. Yeah. Charging expedite, they called it exclusive use vehicles in those days. And they were making a fortune, and I was making a little bit of cut. So I went to my father with a business plan and said, hey, I want to go start my own business. And he goes, look, and at this point, US Press was public. And he's like, I can't back you and fund you as a CEO of a public company, but I'll give you like something to start with. And he's like, we'll give you some trucks to start with. Well, the day came where we're supposed to start this business, and I'd lined up all these customers. And
what kind of business was it?
It was an on-demand expedite truckload business.
Okay.
So we basically said that we would haul within 6. Well, this eventually came in the model, but within 6 hours we would provide as many trucks as you wanted, but we wouldn't guarantee a price, because this is what the air freight forwarders did: is the customers would call them, and let's say you're a pharmaceutical company or you're an automotive company. Yep. And your choice is you're going to charter an airplane for a part, or you're going to bring a truckload in. Right. They'll pay $30,000, $40,000 for a single truck to avoid having to pay the $30,000 to $40,000 charter. That's what air freight forwarders did. That's crazy. And there's this massive arbitrage between truckload and on-demand expedite that existed because your answer was yes when everyone else said no. And that was where these guys were making all the money. Well, I realized that I could go in and start my own business. My dad sort of said, hey, we'll help you start. Well, the day that came to start the business, all the executives in the company, at this point, maybe it's like 500 employees or 800 employees or something like that, maybe even bigger than that those days. They didn't take me very serious. And they were supposed to have gotten everything set up, they didn't, because they were just like, hey, it's Max's son, like we don't have to do it. And I ended up getting all this customer freight from these forwarders who wanted to support me, who had been my air freight customers. And I kept getting turned down by U.S. Express's dispatch operation because they didn't have trucks available for me.
Wow.
And I was like, I got all this business, and I was like, I can't understand. So I ended up working out a deal. I think the executives were sort of patting me on the head of like, this is Max's son. He's gonna fail. They said, Craig, we'll give you as many trucks as you want within 6 hours of 60 major U.S. markets. And I was like, as many as I want. And they thought I would do 2 or 3 a week or something. Man, we loaded up. We were doing, in 2 years, we were doing over, out of LA alone, we did over 1,000 truckloads a day. And like, it was that business.
Under that model.
Under that model. And what we were doing was going to customers and saying, we're not gonna guarantee you a rate. We're gonna guarantee you capacity. And it was basically, you'd walk into the largest shippers, Home Depot, Walmart, all these major companies and say, look, when everyone else says no, when you've run out of options, call us. We want to be your 911 operator for the market. And I remember I was sitting in front of a very large sort of tier 1 logistics company. And the head of supply chain was like, this seems like a great model, but here's my rate structure. And I said, I don't think you understand. When you call me, I set the rate. He's like, who are you? And I'm like, everyone else has said no, and you're gonna pay whatever the market
right.
And this was really before freight brokerage became a thing, because the brokers had not really figured out. In those days, brokerage was a 15-year-old cottage industry. But the freight brokerage industry was not real big. In fact, it was all backhauls. Like, you did not want to take freight from a broker.
Kind of like American backhaul.
It was all that. Yeah. And so the brokers paid, if a market rate was $1.50, they were paying you 80 cents.
Yeah.
And so it was like, nobody wanted freight brokers. Well, we turned it on our head and said, what if we become the opposite of a freight broker? Rather than doing the cheap stuff, what if we only did the premium stuff? And we didn't care who you were. Whatever the market would bear. And so this became super popular because when capacity was tight, companies were looking at the alternatives of shutting down a plant, having to charter an airplane, like all sorts of reasons. And they were willing to pay whatever, because what we're selling against was the idea that I was gonna stock out. Well, this became super successful inside of U.S. Express. In 2 years, we did that business to $140 million in revenue. Our margin on that was $6 to $8 million, by the way. And massively successful. But the problem was that the 100 some odd employees that worked at XD were, in fact, some of them work in this building. Dale Stewart was an XDer.
Yeah.
David Bradford was an Express director. That's where they got their career started. The problem was the people that were working at the XD sales desk were making 1% of the margin. 5% was the number.
Sure.
And some of the margins were, some of these deals were over the course of a month, you could be doing $500,000 with a client or something. And so the amount of money we were paying in commissions was so much bigger than a lot of even VP and C-level executives were making, that it became very tense. And so my father felt that I was a toxic force in the company, because I was like, we were printing the money for the company. At one point, like 85% of the profits. I'm in my early 20s, and you can imagine how cocky we all were. And so effectively, our team got pushed out. And a lot of those guys end up leaving Express Direct. My brother took over it because he was a lot better of a sort of a compliant executive than I was. A lot of those guys ended up going to a company in Chattanooga called Access America. And now Coyote came and bought it. And so that kicked off Chattanooga's sort of like renaissance of brokerage in Chattanooga, because a lot of the XD model, the Express Direct model, was this on-demand. We had a really aggressive pod structure of compensation, and it was it was fun.
It was a good time.
It was a great time.
But it was a run. But you think about it from the step back. Your dad started one of the top 10 largest trucking companies in America. uncle started
Yep.
Covenant, another large trucking company. Then Craig became part of that trucking dynamic. But at some point, he said, you know what? This is not fun for me anymore. I might.
Well, I got fired. My older brother saw me as a threat.
Really?
And yeah, because I was running the most profitable business that I had just started. I learned the air freight business. I was in my early 20s and had taken a business that I had seen in air freight and applied it into. I had first right of refusal on every truck in the U.S. Express system. I think at this point,
It's a lot of power.
a couple thousand trucks at this point. I think we had like 3,000 at the end of that run. It grew a lot from the mid 90s to like so at this point we had a couple thousand trucks. It was a big company. I think that year the company hit like $1 billion at the end when I left. And it was obvious that my older brother was going to be CEO. And we could undispatch any truck in the system. We literally we had our own set of rules. We could unassign any dispatch. We could bump customer freight. I could tell you stories. So one time I remember FedEx was a huge customer. And FedEx called US Express. FedEx was probably 5% of the business, biggest customer in the system. FedEx called, wanted a truckload, and they got turned down. US Express didn't have trucks. So the next thing FedEx did was it called Yellow Exact, which was their on-demand business.
Yeah.
The Yellow offered in those days. And Yellow Exact called XD. XD said, yes, we'll take it.
Oh.
But here was the secret. We could unassign any truck in the system. So naturally, the load planner decided to unassign so he sends a SATCOM message to a FedEx, to a truck that's at the FedEx dock, to the driver, and says, I got a new XD load for you. It's super hot, and I need you to basically take this load. He goes, hey, they just loaded me, and goes, I need you to tell them to unload it.
Wow.
So he walks into the FedEx dock to the office and says, I need you to unload this trailer. And they're like, what's up? He goes, hey, I have apparently dispatch wants me to take this other load. So they unload him. He gets in his truck and goes down 4 doors and walks in. And they're like, wait a second.
Weren't you just down there
You were just down there, and you were under a different dispatch, which we give business directly with US Express, and now I had to go through this broker to get access to this capacity and pay 5 times as much.
Oh, it sounds shady.
And, this was shady as hell. And that was the problem with the business, was that our rules at XD were we could do we had right of first refusal on any truck in the system. And we would charge anything that the market would bear.
Yeah.
And we just didn't care. And I had the most ruthless operators that you could ever ask for. By the way, Dale Stewart, who
That's my guy. Dale Stewart's my guy.
Was one of the top. There was this other guy. And you think that the top operators, we call them freight coordinators. These are like effectively internal brokers. You always think that the real like aggressive ones, Dale, he's very passive and timid. And what I actually found in that process was the more timid and the more humble, the better that those guys did on the margins, because everyone liked them.
Yeah.
And what I found is that the more obnoxiously aggressive ones, the ones you would expect to do well, didn't do very well. It was they were in the mid-range. The ones that had no drive did horrible, but the ones with kind of like a lot of drive that were
almost
really
like
aggressive.
that passive aggressiveness.
It was like this, the kids that you would expect, and most of us were in our kids, we're all in our 20s. The ones you would expect to do well, these were the quarterback types, the good-looking kids, the really aggressive ones. The ones you would say, that person's a good salesperson. They were in the mid-range. It was actually the real timid, humble ones that just killed it.
Wow.
So the ones you didn't expect. But anyways, so I became a destructive force inside the company, and my brother and my dad decided I had to end my career.
Man. Wow.
It was a hell of a run.
Wow. But you think about that too, and you think about building a business as the folks that are on this call. At some point, you have to make hard decisions.
Yeah.
And making hard decisions are part about the business. So we're going to fast forward a little bit. We go past the US Express days, XD days, get a little down a little further. You started a fuel card.
So US Express had a fuel card business. So my father wanted me out of XD and US Express, and because at this point, the energy we were bringing was toxic to the culture, the whole company. And they had a fuel card business that was a real small fleet fuel card business. And that wasn't a big business. It was a real small. I think it was like 10 employees or something. And that's what I took over. So we took that business from really just U.S. Express the only client to really building it. And that was my first foray into building a business on my own.
Right. And then you took that and you walked away from that.
I got fired again.
Oh, no.
So we sold part of the business to U.S. Bank, and that became the U.S. Bank Forger Fleet Card. That was a super successful transaction, and it was basically doing payment processing, full processing. And my father, we sold off part of the business to U.S. Bank, and the rest of the business, part of the business we kept. And the business got growing really quickly. But anytime you run a tech business, when you grow quickly, you end up just accumulating a lot of cash.
Absolutely.
And I had tried to raise money throughout that history, and I actually brought opportunities to my dad to help raise it, but he didn't want to raise it. He wanted to fund it himself. And the problem is my ambition was so great that I wanted to keep growing. And at some point, you had to fund that.
Yeah.
And so the business got in a really, really difficult position where it almost ran out of money. And my father thought I was, again, needed to go. And so he let me go that time too.
So you got into, was it day trading? You got kind of interested
so I got
in that?
fired in 2014 and sort of went into the wilderness of
Yeah,
sorts.
trying to figure things out.
Yeah, as a founder, as an entrepreneur, as a business person who's sort of like I was never an exceptional athlete. I played soccer and I was good when I was younger, and then everyone got faster than me, and I was never an exceptional athlete. I was never a good student. I was a 2.52 GPA. But the one thing that I always had a knack for was business. And the problem was when I had let my father down the second time, not the first. The first time was more, I felt like I was doing the right things. I was just destructive culturally to this big company. The second time around, I put the company in a compromising position because my ambition to grow that thing so well had outstretched the ability to fund it. And this happens in a lot of companies. And it's oddly enough that you could grow a business so quickly that you end up basically compromising the business. And I think this is a powerful lesson because a lot of times your ambition to grow really quickly can outstretch the cash and the ability to fund it. And that's true in technology business. So my dad let me go in 2014 from the company was called TransCard. By the way, now a super successful part of the family's portfolio. My brother now runs it. So I went into the wilderness. He effectively told me, because you'll be a bad CEO and you should never try to run a company. That's what he said. My father said that in 14.
How'd that feel?
Oh, I crushed. This is a man I adored. I mean, I grew up around trucking, and I remember, I just wanted to be him. I wanted to be my father, but just do something even more ambitious than what he had done. And I was crushed. And I went into a deep, deep, deep place, a dark place, because effectively my ego was bankrupt. My self-belief, my confidence, everything was gone in my mind. And I realized so much of this business stuff is just not that important. It was important to me, but it wasn't important no one cared. And what you find is the people you think are your friends are, when you're doing well, everyone's there. You find really quickly when you're not, that life is different. And look, it's just reality. I'm not trying to bring anybody down or play victim, because that's certainly not the case. But you do find out that things can get tough. And for someone who thought they were at the top, being at the bottom, it was a pretty dark time for me.
But you kind of figured it out, though.
I did.
You figured it out.
I did. And this was the first time in my life that I'd always had the comfort of having the family and the family business. And this is the first time. I remember my dad said I shouldn't be a CEO, and he was not going to support me in any way whatsoever. He wasn't making calls on my behalf. He wasn't writing a check. He didn't think I was credible. He literally was checked out on me as someone that's my son, but
right.
I wasn't dead to him.
We're not mixing business with pleasure,
But just not gonna step up for me. And honestly, it's the best thing he ever did for me, because I realized all that success that I had before. There's a part of me that felt like a little bit of, was it real? Was it authentic? Did I do this, or was it given to me?
Right.
A lot of that's in your head. And this was the first time in my life that I actually was able to prove it, because I went out there, had at this point, had not a lot of money to invest in the business. And I actually didn't have a lot of cash. The only thing I had was a good credit score. And I was able to open up a credit card and get a 0 APR credit card from Bank of America. And took out, basically charged up the business, and I founded it through Bank of America.
Wow. Wow.
I wouldn't recommend that.
Yeah, I don't think we want to do that, but that's the way it worked.
How I started
it worked out.
And then it did work out.
So now we hit the fast forward button just a little bit, go to 6th gear, and now we're on the high side now. Now let's talk about a little bit of Freightways.
It was not easy in the early days. I mean, there were multiple times we couldn't make payroll.
Why Freightways though? Where did this concept come from?
So I was day trading unsuccessful. This is where all my money went. So I had made a little bit of money in the business, Transcard's business, but I blew it all.
Yeah.
Day trading. But
the ambitions is there. Your ambitions
there.
Is there.
And when you've been and you've had success and you tasted it,
you want
this
more.
This is a gambler's mentality. You want to go back.
Yeah.
And
why not?
The thing about trading or gambling is oftentimes it's quick, right? It solves all these. You feel like, okay, business is hard, and building things is hard, but gambling or day trading, which is actually really horrible for gambling.
Yeah.
Because I think something like 98% of day traders lose money. It feels easy, but it's actually quite the opposite. And you can get a couple wins. So anyways, I lost a lot of money day trading, and that was when I had to go get a proper job. But there was this moment where I just met my wife, and this moment where I had just had this calling where I didn't care. I'd been at the low, and I didn't care about failing. And it was before oftentimes you start caring about failing, and you don't do anything.
Yeah.
I didn't care. I'd already felt like
the fear of failure is
low.
gone.
It's gone. I didn't care. Who cares?
Yeah.
I'll go to another job somewhere. Yeah. And it's when I started what is now Freightways. And I'd been day trading stocks unsuccessfully, as I said. And I kept watching CNBC, and they kept talking about all these other markets that were an indication economy, like oil and ocean shipping and all that stuff. They never talked about trucking as a barometer of the economy.
It wasn't cool. It wasn't sexy.
It wasn't cool. And I'm like, there should be a business that talks about the freight market the way every other market's talked about. The way that you talk about the stock market.
The weather, you name it.
Oil, the oil markets have their markets and people talk about it. Or now crypto is kind of a big thing. They didn't ever talk about trucking on TV, and no one ever talked about it in the market itself. And that was the original idea for Freightways. Was I wanted to create an information hub and data business, and this trading was also an idea based on trucking. And that was the original idea. I took my trading desire. And the other thing is that XD formation, that on-demand business I talked about, where we would charge whatever. We had to get really good at, because we would get hundreds of calls a day. And literally, not even an exaggeration, it could be 1,000 truckloads out of LA.
Yeah.
You would have to get really good at figuring out what markets were going to pop. And so we had built these really arbitrary, basic models of looking at the entire country and figuring out, okay, we can see this market starting to heat. So what we need to do is start pushing trucks in that
area,
even without a truckload, without a dispatch. So we would start basically planning,
getting them in the area,
and also pricing. We had to be really good at raising prices in markets, and we could see it all happen. And that was my enamorization with on-demand trucking, and that became the formation idea for Freightways, which was if you could take the data and you could see the whole market, and you had data to understand it, then you could get ahead of these trends because you would have the advantage. And that was the original foundation for Sonar. Was I wanted to understand, could you build a data business that actually understood where the market was headed, not where it had been? And so much of the information that was out in the market was about where it had been.
The lagging indicators.
In fact, we had the opportunity to, in the early days, we struggled to get any kind of attention. And I had this idea and the concept, and nobody was talking about it. I remember I tried to get some media for it and struggled. Even local chatting newspaper wouldn't pick it up. The editor ended up working for me at some point, but they wouldn't even pick up the story about what we were trying to do. And I remember posting a job to bring a social blogger on, and the guy's name is Brian Strait, and he was the editor at Fleet Owner, and he told me, he's like, nobody ever cares about the economic or market news. He's like, in trucking at Fleet Owner, one of the big trucking publications, no one ever cares about what's happening in the freight market. He's like, we write about the economy, no one ever reads it. And I was like, man, this is all you're gonna write about. Like, this is what we're gonna do. And what I realized was his perception was because this was a print magazine that operated on, where their information was released, they would take the FTR report or the ATA data, just 6 months old. What had happened in the market in 6 months had changed. So they may talk about how great the trucking market was based on months old data. But what the industry was living in was this market that was about today and tomorrow, not about what happened 6 months ago. And that was the difference that Freightways made. And that was the sort of like reality that we were able to bring to the market, was this sort of real-time understanding, because we treated it like a sports event. We treated it like CNBC would treat the street to stock market. And it was like we were there to play, and we could talk about rates and market dynamics every single day and never get tired of it. And that was completely different.
You guys were the pioneers of high frequency data. You came into the marketplace, gave a concept that wasn't even on the playbook, created a niche, ran into a little bit of turbulence. I want to walk through a little bit of turbulence. As the model was built and we've gained some traction behind it, it became the hub, nevertheless, for news. When you look at small carriers, large carriers, everywhere in between, you've been on Fox Business, CNBC, things accelerated rather quickly. One of the things that kind of I don't even want to say as an undercurrent, but let's call it a little bit of turbulence on the flight. From a small carrier perspective, kind of felt like, hey, you know what? It feels like we're being left out a little. What was your thoughts on it?
I think it's a fair statement. I mean, I think the view that the market is taking on its own life, and that we are bringing information to that's helping people take advantage of that, is absolutely true. Is that if you look at businesses and markets where there is more information, there are the companies that are able to use that quicker and faster actually have the advantage. And I think early on, a lot of the small operators did not understand the power of information. They didn't know what to do. Look, we were a force. We came out of nowhere. We, when we first started the business, there was CCJ, Fleet Owner, Transport Topics, and there was little us, and it was like 2 people. And all of a sudden, we became this massively quick growing business. And a lot of the data, like Sonar's tender rejection data, a lot of it was very confusing. And there was a point in the market where people were not understanding what we were doing or why we were doing it. And I think when you have a situation where people don't understand something, they have a tendency to believe that it's out to them. And this is true in the news side.
That's like conspiracy theories. If I don't understand it.
So all of a sudden, the best example I can give you of this is in 2022. This was when I realized that there was a huge amount. This is where we got a lot of backlash. Early on, we were a niche publication, but at this point, we started to really matter. And we started talking about the imminent freight recession. Freight's dropping off a cliff. The freight recession is imminent. This had been March 2022. And I remember the stock market sold off, by the way. Like the big trucking companies and everybody reacted to our data. And this was all public. We weren't like, put it on the website. It wasn't like we hid it to anybody. And it wasn't like anybody else had an advantage over anyone else, because all the information was there. But the bigger players in the market, Wall Street and the bigger companies, reacted to our information.
They took a hit,
but they also realized, hey, like, we trust this data source, and they started to position themselves. And I remember for months, I was talking about this freight recession. And at this point, the broader part of the freight market had not seen the softening. Like, it was happening in the data, but it was slow to happen. Some would say fast. In the data, if you look at it in hindsight, it felt very fast. But if you looked at it on a day-to-day basis, it felt like a slow. And maybe all of a sudden, I remember we were getting attacked because people were saying that we were hurting the small carriers. I would argue the opposite, because we were telling small carriers that the downturn was coming, that winter was coming, and they better prepare for it. And we said that to the big companies and small companies. It was all out there.
Yeah.
And I think the companies that took that information to heart and prepared for the downturn were able to survive it and were able to potentially thrive in it. And the ones that didn't, that ignored it because they thought we were manipulating the market or we were lying to them, we were trying to create advantage, potentially lost out. I remember I had multiple people would argue with me in the summer of 22 that I was just trying to manipulate the market, or I had shorting the trucking market or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's like, this is the data. The recession is coming. I'm telling you, it's coming. And people just didn't want to believe it. They didn't want to believe it, and they couldn't believe it. And they couldn't believe. And what was crazy about it at that moment in time, DAT and ATA and all of these other sources were out telling everybody that the market was okay, that we were wrong. And for a short period of time, nobody knew where the market was going to end up. We now know that freight recession absolutely happened. That was the first time that I think there was this real big disagreement with what we were doing, because it was this belief that we were trying to help. I remember people were accusing us of the brokers, of conspiring with the brokers. I'm like, who am I conspiring with?
Way too fragmented.
Too fragmented. And who am I advantaging anyway?
Yeah.
If I had information that gave everyone else an advantage, and I was selling it just to them, I wouldn't be publishing it.
Yeah.
It made no sense to be broadcasting something that was happening and do it in a public forum if you were trying to benefit one group of people over the other. Our job is to bring information. Now, we did that also. It was interesting in 2020. I got the opposite effect. This is early. This is before the 22 call, 2 years before it, where I came out and told shippers they better lock in contract rates before they're going to go up. And I got accused of like manipulating this. People were like, well, your family owns US Express. You're just trying to do this to help their stock price. I'm like, it does not work that way. But that was the opposite happened in 22. It's a lot easier to be talking about how great things are coming if you're in a market.
Sure.
It's
You'll be a hero.
It's pretty hard when you're against the grain and you fundamentally believe that you're right because the data says that you're right. And that was where a lot of the controversy happened. And that's where a lot of the belief we're out to get small carriers, that this is only for big companies. And that is not the case at all. In fact, the smallest carriers have gained the most through information. The data that we have was never previously available.
That's right.
Except to the biggest companies. We took a playbook that I learned at US Express, and we said, if we could take that data that used to be only held by the biggest trucking companies, turndowns we used to call them, the tender rejection data, you know, the JB Hunts and the Swifts and the Werners and the US Expresses, they had a sense of the market through their own rejection data. We democratize that to everybody. So now everyone in the market, including the smallest players, have an advantage of knowing where the market's at, and not this information isn't held by just a couple of people. It's everybody's information.
So you broke the walls down, and it's up to you. We talk about tactical actions inside Playbook, about you can have as much information that you want, but if you don't put any efforts behind those information, it really doesn't matter. So predicted this freight recession, fast forward a little bit, predicted that things are turning around, and then all of a sudden, the concept of Playbook came out of nowhere.
Yeah, so you and I met. So the November 8th, that's my brother's birthday, that's the reason I remember the date, of this past year was when we sort of declared the freight recession. It was 2 days after the election. There was a lot of sort of like vibes in the economy, particularly in freight economy. And, but it was very clear that the market was coming around, that a lot of the capacity was leaving. There was a lot of reasons for this. And it was actually interesting because you posted a tweet, might have been that week or the week after, about the incoming clearinghouse, the change, basically the enforcement of the clearinghouse. And I remember I saw it when F3, which is our big event in Chattanooga, and I was like, you got to come talk about this, because for all the things that we do here, we sometimes, some of the bigger stories just may not get as much play. We'd written about it and talked about it some, but we weren't really honed in on how important this topic was. You tweeted it, invited you to come talk about it, and as we're sitting on stage, I'm thinking to myself, Adam understands this industry as much as anyone I've ever met. You understand how small carriers think, and you've built a platform to provide the information. You took your own experience of being in the market, of being an operator, being a driver, and providing the same level of resources for small carriers. And there's something powerful about that. And even though our backgrounds are very different in terms of how we grew up in this business, we've come together because, and I think this is what is really important, is you have a way of taking these really, these concepts that we talk a lot about and take it in a way that makes it actionable for the small players. Because we're focused on putting the information out to everyone. And your focus is, I am going to empower the smallest guys out there so they have the same understanding of what the big carriers are doing. So that mystery, that box, that sense that I am powerless, that the people, the man is taking advantage of me, that I get to at least see behind the curtain. And I think that's pretty cool. I have a big company background. I come from big trucking, but I'm also an entrepreneur founder, and I have a lot of grit myself. And you find in businesses that there's always the way that you think things work and the way they actually do.
Sure.
And I think we have the opportunity to open up the kimono for everyone so they can see really what's happening.
You know, I thought what was, and just sort of people that are listening can understand, you're an accountable guy, a very accountable guy. And I'm going to tell you why. And, you know, just in the time that I've known you, our social media relationships goes back a couple of years. We've DM'd, obviously we've had some conversations on other things. But the thing that resounded about you and your intention behind this project was you sent me a message saying, hey, we need to sit down and talk. And then I was like, sure, yep, get back to you next week. Then you send me a message the following day, like, hey, what's up with next week? Like, I really want to do this thing. Like, you really, really want to like put this thing together. So I got on a plane, flew down here. We spent some time together and whiteboarded it out. You're doing your thing. If people really understand that, that your passion is from entrepreneurial success because you've seen entrepreneurial failure.
Oh, yeah.
And the biggest failure sometimes propels the biggest successes. And I thought that was very, very honorable for you. As we kind of close out, I'm going to come up with 3 things.
All right.
And I want you to give me one word that comes to mind. You only get one word that comes to mind for everything I say. Okay, I'm going to give you 3 things.
All right.
Ready? Tariffs.
Controversial.
Automation.
I could use the same term. Inevitable.
Broker transparency.
Ludicrous.
Man, it's been what an...
Am I allowed to expand
You can expand, go ahead, expand on that, because you know that there's going to be...
Which one do you want to expand on?
You pick one of the 3. Only one.
Okay.
Broker transparency.
I think the idea that you're going to make the market, you're going to force people... So the whole issue around this, Adam, is that the reason small operators can exist. So if you go back to, U.S. Express was very successful in the 90s as a long-haul trucking company. But if you go look at CFI, Transport America,
good God,
Covenant, Celadon, if you go back to the 90s, these were the most successful trucking companies. CRST, DART, they were the top of the game. And they're all like Celadon, rest in peace. But the long-haul business, all those companies have either struggled in the long-haul business or have gone out of business or have left the entire long-haul. Covenant, except for their team operations, has left the long-haul business. U.S. Express struggled for years. And there's 2 things that happened. One is intermodal started to clean the clock of that long-haul freight. And the second thing that happened is the proliferation of freight brokers. But one of the things that happened over the last 10 years is that when I was in freight in the early 2000s, is brokers were a minor part of the market. But when the economy would get bad, all of the freight, it wasn't rates that were the problem. It was all the freight that dried up for the brokers. So the small operators would go under because it was not a matter of whether there was a $2 a mile load. It was a matter of whether there was loads at all.
Yeah, it wasn't there.
Because all of the shippers gave all their freight to their core carriers and none of the stuff was left over. The scraps were always available for the brokers and the small operators. But over the last 20 years, something shifted because the brokers went from something like 6% market share in the year 2000 to like a third.
Wow.
And the reason that happened is that the brokers said, I can provide solutions to shippers and I can offer better solutions and better service by offering freight to the smallest operators to shippers. And now brokers play a primary role, oftentimes a top player, if not number one, number two, number three in the routing guide.
Yep.
And when that happened, it opened up so much opportunity for small operators. And that is why small operators have had the opportunity to be successful. And so now we have a situation where people are saying, I want to have broker transparency because I think the brokers are making too much money. But what they don't realize is if you run a large asset trucking company, so much of the work of running that trucking company is finding freight, is pricing freight, is dispatching those trucks. That's the role that the broker plays in it today, collecting and paying payments. Why do you care at the end of the day what a broker makes in it? It should not matter to you. And so what's going to end up happening if we have this broker transparency concept that actually exists is A, why does it matter? These guys run successful businesses. They're giving you freight if they didn't exist. But what's going to end up happening is the shippers are going to become informed of what they're paying. And on that dedicated freight, that freight that's coming in every single day, the shipper is going to say, you're charging me $2 a mile and you're paying your carriers $1.60. What do you think the shippers are going to do?
Going to lower that rate. They're
going to come to the broker and they're going to say, I want you to pay, you're making 40 cents a mile on me. I'm only going to pay you $1.60. And the broker's got a choice. They can either take the freight at, maybe they make $1.65, maybe they're making a couple pennies, or they can take and say, we're not taking the load. What do you think the broker's going to do if they can't make money?
Oh my God, what do you think they're going to do?
They're not going to continue to take
continue, yeah.
They're going to exit those opportunities because they're going to say, I don't want to take freight that I have a risk of losing money on. And when they do that, or I can't make money because I got to support all this infrastructure. I got people, I got technology, I got systems, I got payments, collections, all that stuff. They're going to leave that market entirely. And when they do, those opportunities are going to dry up because the shippers are going to end up winning. Like if you don't know anything about trucking, you should know that the bigger shippers are always the winners. That's why drivers don't get paid detention. That's why truck parking's a problem. That's why when you walk into a shipping office, they don't spend time caring about whether you have access to facilities because they control the market, not individually, but shippers set the tone of the market. And if you think for a second, if that information is transparent, that won't get in the hands of those shippers because they're allowed under broker transparency to get it, you've got something coming. And here's the reason that matters, is if brokers start to say, we don't want to do business where we can't make a proper margin, then those opportunities that used to be available for small carriers will no longer be available. And who will win? It will be the Werners, the Knights, the U.S. Expresses, the Covenants. They're going to get those opportunities back. It's not going to be available because the broker's not going to bid on it. And now the small carriers who lived and died on this business are not going to have access to it. That's why I think it's a ludicrous concept because ultimately the market's going to clear it, what the market clears out, and that's what matters.
Wow. Well, Craig, this has been an amazing, insightful discussion. I truly enjoyed the conversation. I know the listeners enjoyed it. We've got an amazing project that we're putting together. I know this week we've been working really, really hard towards the project. For the listeners that are out there, I want you to leave them with a parting thought. Just for the owner-operators, the smallest fleet, the owner-operator, the one-truck guy, the two-truck guy, the three-truck guy, just a parting thought just to leave with them for the day.
You know, this is a business that gets in your blood. And it's a business that, in trucking, that once it's in you, it's hard to get out of. But it's also a business. And I think the thing that I have learned to appreciate most is that there are rules to a game. And because it is a business, if you can figure out the rules of the game, you can win. And that's what's nice about business, is that it's meant to win. That's why the reason businesses can be successful. And I would say that what you're doing with Playbook, what we're doing as partners in this project, is that we are going to give power to the smallest operators to understand what that playbook looks like so that they have the advantages. And that's what I'm most passionate about.
Well, Craig, thank you so much for taking the time out today and hanging out with us on on the inaugural podcast, the inaugural episode. Listen, everybody, looking forward to seeing everybody next week on our next podcast episode. Make sure you check us out on all of the podcast channels. You're streaming it online. I'm excited to work with you, and let's here's to the long haul.